Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Space Academy Takeover Week. We are taking over the National Space Centre's social media all this week to host Q&As with interesting people from the space sector, bringing them here to answer your questions. My name is Kieran, and I'm the General Manager of the National Space Academy, and I am joined now by Anuradha Damale. Oh my God, I just got your name wrong. It's so embarrassing. Anuradha Damale, who is here from Vertic, and she has a background in an interest in space for a long time, and also now works in areas of security and policy. And we're going to ask her a bit about how that relates to defence. But first, Anu, how are you?
I'm all right, thank you. Don't worry about my name. Everyone calls me Anu. But Kieran, you've known me long enough. Come on.
I've always known you as Anu and then not got to, but yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for coming along and giving up your evening to answer some questions.
Talk about space, always.
Really enjoying your background, by the way. Were you on the Earth at the moment?
I am floating around Earth. Ultimate social distancing.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I am on planet Earth at the moment.
Okay. Good to know. So yeah, do you want to tell us a bit about your background and what you do and how it relates to the space sector?
Sure. So I thought maybe what would be interesting is to talk a little bit about the whole sort of background compressed into a couple of minutes. So as Kieran says, I work at an organization called Vertic, which is a non-governmental organization that works in international relations and policy. What that means is that we're not aligned to any government, and we do research and make policy advice to governmental agencies or big agencies like the United Nations, or agencies like the NHS. So it varies on what area we're working in. And I work in nuclear and space, at two separate things, and we're going to keep them that way. But yeah, so I largely work on nuclear, but I was hired because I was interested in working in space policy, which turns out was a great thing because space policy is booming at the moment, and I'm sure we'll come around to that later on in the conversation. So my background's actually in physics. I went to a state school in Southall, in deep West London. Neither of my parents went to university. They were immigrants to this country, and I kind of really liked planes for a long time, and then that developed into a love for rockets. I kind of went, do I want to be a pilot? Do I want to be a lawyer? Like, what do I want to do? And I come from a very rare Indian family where my parents are both arts people, and they were like, just do whatever you want and be a decent human being. And I liked school, so I stuck it out and did physics at Durham as my undergraduate degree. And I thought, research cosmologist, this is what I'm going to do. And then things happened. Things happened in the world that impacted me, as an ethnic minority and as a woman, and as a queer woman and as a daughter of immigrants in the world, that made me realize that I actually care about how science connects to social issues. So Brexit happened, which has an impact on the UK's, it has an impact on us in many ways, but more relevantly, it has an impact on our scientific knowledge and our knowledge base in this country, and on the, I don't know how many immigrants that bring their expertise to this country and organizations in the EU that collaborate with this country. And Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. Now, I am big on not focusing on Western global events all the time. Lots of other things have happened as well, but those two key events really sent ripples through the younger population of our country. And I started getting involved in more advocacy work, and realized that actually I care more about how we use science and technology for good, your definition of good, and regulate it when it is being used for bad, or prevent it from being used for bad. And so with my physics background, I decided to do a master's in science and technology policy at the Science Policy Research Unit, where I thought, I was going to end up doing governance, ended up in a random lecture about biological weapons use, and thought, this is mad interesting. Like, this is what I want to do. I not use biological weapons, but put into place things that can stop the use by using my understanding of science and using my understanding of policy. That snowballed. I ended up writing a dissertation on nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. and through various interactions on Twitter, which is a great community to be part of, became part of an organization called UK SEDS, which is the National Space Charity for Students. And it's awesome. It's amazing. I ran diversity events with them. I met Kieran through them. I ended up being chair of the organization for a year and getting back in touch with my love for space. And then got a job after writing 68 job applications after my master's at Vertic. So in the meanwhile, I, waitressed and tutored and did what I could, and started working at Vertic as an intern and then an assistant researcher. So now I look at, how do we control things that are already happening that are bad, quote unquote, in for us in the security world? How do we explain to countries that actually these things influence all of us? And how do we make that knowledge less protected and more available for more people? Because security is something for all of us. It's human security, it's climate security, it's energy security, it's economic security. So how my thing is, I'm a scholar of systems theory, which is breaking apart silos and sectors and showing how interconnected they are. And unfortunately, security is still a very siloed field. People focus a lot on nuclear or chemical or terrorism without understanding that they connect to our greater economy and to the people in that economy. And it just so happens that the space sector is a huge example and an obvious example of this interconnectedness. And that's how I've ended up doing what I do. I also run an organization called WCAPS in the UK, which is Women of Colour Advancing Peace and Security. And it's all about empowering minorities through leadership of women in colour within the peace, security and conflicts transformation sort of space. Because as much as science is bad, security is worse for EDI and accessibility. And we really want to make it a more inclusive space, because we think that, if security is meant to be for everyone, and if the policies are failing, there's a reason why. We need to have a more inclusive table. So yeah, that's me in 7 minutes.
That's amazing. And it really resonates with me when you talk about the interconnectedness of science. That's what we're seeing all this week, all the interconnectedness of space in particular. We're seeing with all the different Q&As, these are all people working in the space sector, but working in such different areas. And when working with young people as well, one of the things we find in schools is that people get channeled into particular subjects to study. And it can sometimes be after your degree, you've ended up kind of bringing back a few different areas that you're interested in.
100%. So like I said, I went to a state school that was largely ethnic minorities and free school meal students. So it wasn't a very well-off school. We didn't really have like a proper music department or like a further maths A level. But I was lucky because I was proactive and I lived in London, which in and of itself, especially in the time that I was doing my GCSEs and A-levels about 10 years ago, wow, was a benefit. It was definitely a benefit, but for a lot of people it wasn't. And we were forced either by our parents or departments to start thinking really early on about what we wanted to do, and then just think A-levels are the be all and end all, university is the be all and end all. And as someone who messed up their undergraduate degree due to mental health and still managed to get back on track, university feels like the be all and end all, but I promise you, like, it's okay to figure out what you want to do a little bit further down along the line. Like, you don't need to work in something that is passion. You can embrace your passion in different ways. But if you're the kind of person whose work needs to be something they care about, then there is no shame in waiting it out and deciding that even now, like if I change my mind, yes, it'll be hard, but I can still redirect. It's important to understand that your subjects are skill sets and not protected knowledge characteristics, Yeah,
no, definitely. When it sounds like, when you describe being in that lecture with the biological weapons being discussed, sounds like you had a bit of a moment then.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't something you knew about before. You weren't age 11 going, I want to work on security policy.
No, I was sat in that room. So it was funny because all my teachers at school were like, you're very good at science, you're very good at music. You could do like writing if you wanted to, blah, blah, blah. But they were like, you seem political. Like, why aren't you aiming for a career in politics? And I was like, because no. Like, if someone told me at school that this career existed that I was in, I would have been like, what? Even now, because of the lack of representation or knowledge about the career paths, or because we present degrees as such linear things and education as this sort of linear sausage press, it blindsides people. And I remember sitting in that lecture, you know, I was more on the governance side of things, but I've always enjoyed sort of wargaming and board games and escape rooms. And the situation was, and the situation was, believe it or not, it was that a viral strain of an infection, this was in 2018, has escaped. And it started as an endemic and now it's a pandemic. What do you do? Like, you are in the room of decision makers at the WHO. From a biosecurity and safety perspective, what do you do? And you obviously in real life, you'll have a day or two to do it, but we had 3 hours. And it was the most intense 3 hours ever. Everyone was exhausted, but I left tired, but like, oh my God, like buzzing, like I'd had like 7 coffees or something. It was really, really good. And I knew then that, you know, this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to apply my knowledge of how viruses spread, statistics, physics, you know, the mechanism of all of it, to potentially saving lives and making Earth safer. And humanity safer. And that's kind of, you know, I'm very lucky, and I recognize that is what I get to do as my job. Don't get me wrong, it's not glam every day, but
yeah, you say that you're lucky, but actually you said that you did an internship with Vertic at first. So
yes,
it may be partly luck, but it does sound like you chased down the kind of role.
Oh hell yeah. And I didn't want to do it for free. That was my thing. I couldn't afford to do unpaid internships, and it's something I'm vehemently against. And it is classist. It's, you know, an issue in social mobility. And, you know, I had to turn down a UN internship because it was unpaid. Like I couldn't do it. And yes, you know, it took me a year of miserable job applications. And yes, I was lucky that I could continue to live with my parents and work, you know, do tutoring, waitress, earn money to be able to, you know, not feel like a train. And, you know, I was able to do that, but it wasn't easy. And I knew that it was about the time, just before the time I thought, you know, if this doesn't work out, I need to do something else. I need to do something else to get those transferable skills.
Okay.
And then go back.
That's so interesting. So a lot of the things you're saying really resonate with some of the things other speakers have said about following your interest.
Yeah.
Just like keep going when things get difficult, and not giving up at the first hurdle. So it's interesting that you were kind of going to give up your search, but you were going to see if you could come at it from another direction.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, and firstly, I've said this before and I'll say it again, not everyone wants to work in a field that is their interest, and not everyone wants to do something that is deemed meaningful. Every job is meaningful. Every job contributes to society, and not everyone wants to do that. But if you are that kind of person, you will be miserable if you don't find a way. And that's draining. And I am that kind of person, and I know that, and I always knew that. But there were times where I was like, there is no way out, you know, like I come from a background where my family didn't go to university. My parents were never academic. We were not particularly well off. And there's a certain profile that goes with the kind of person that works in my field. And let it be known that I don't fit that profile. And I'm trying to fix that, you know, through WCATS. But without having the people that you're trying to form the security for and the policy for at the table, you can't, like, you're never going to make the right decisions, because you can't teach experience. You can't teach tacit knowledge. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. And the priorities that different people have. I think we've seen that as a nation throughout the handling of the pandemic. And I'm not at all going to ask you to comment on, you know, how the government has done, unless you want to. But a lot of the decisions that were taken at different stages, particularly early on, didn't necessarily think through how it would impact, say, self-employed people, or when schools were closing, about people who really needed their children in school to be able to work, and if employers weren't able to find a way around that. And I personally got the feeling that if people were in the room who had that knowledge and experience, maybe those decisions wouldn't have happened. But is that a good way for people to understand how an example about what policy is and what it means to create policy?
Yeah. So, I could talk about the handling of COVID for another hour session. Like, that's a different session altogether. But yeah, what it comes down to is, what kind of economy does your country have? What do they prioritize? Are these things, is your country's system, the way that it works, is it designed to benefit everyone? Is it designed to benefit big businesses first? Is it designed to put people first? Is it designed for people that are minorities? Is it designed for people that don't look like you? And often the first step, and I'm not saying, I don't think representation is everything, because that tick boxing doesn't work. The first step is actually understanding the nitty-gritty of what your community looks like. And if you don't have that understanding, you're never going to benefit them. And I think for me, there were several issues with the handling of the pandemic, information being one of them. And also just like framing and an understanding of what the population will, the language that they'll understand. Like, it's been very haughty words, 300-page documents. We have a lot of families here that are on a low income that are just surviving. They don't have the time, they don't have the information literacy, and that's not their fault. That's their life, and you have allowed them to live their life like that. Or you have lots of students or people on Twitter that haven't had a civics lesson in schools. So they don't know how to interpret that. And so I have gone through the sort of cycle as I've gotten older. And I think the past 2 years I've been at the stage where I can't get angry at people for not understanding that, because there's a reason. I can if I explain it to them as a science policy person. Like, this is my job. Like, it's taking these complex things, making them understandable and equitable and fair, and trying to deliver them through the delivery mechanism, which in our case is the government. And yeah, so that's basically what science policy is. Like, take that and apply it to something else. So apply it to launches of mega constellations, for instance.
So just tell everyone what a mega constellation is, because it's a very space sector term.
Yes, a mega constellation is loads and loads of satellites that are launched into space to shape a specific form, basically. So there's a specific one that's being talked about at the moment. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the name Elon Musk. If you haven't, they're a billionaire who own a company called Tesla, the electric cars, and kind of have proliferated in the direction of space. So like they do a lot of space related things, and they're a commercial entity. So when I say commercial entity, I mean they're not a government agency or a government department. And so the rules and regulations surrounding what they can do are not the same for their government, nor for really any other company. And so when you have, so in the case of COVID, there were some guidelines, there's some government regulation surrounding things, there's some precedent for we can make some things illegal, we can't make some things illegal. When you don't have some basic framework that is universal for something like space, which doesn't impact one country, right? There are no borders in space. It's just space, it's just out there. So when you don't have a basic set of rules or behavior that people will adhere to, that is effective for the life that you're living right now, where there are lots of things in space, people are going to put more things in space, and more people are becoming interested in space. When you don't have that basic framework to make sure that it can work optimally, then it's really, really hard to regulate. And it's really, really hard to attribute or to blame, in some cases, actions on certain people or governments or companies, because it's just not a thing. And that's the reason why space policy is like really interesting right now, because
there must be so much work to do in space policy right now, by the sounds of it. It's kind of, it feels a bit Wild West, and that the ability to put, 20 years ago you wanted to put a satellite into space, it was the size of a bus, you needed a huge amount of money. Nowadays you're talking about mega constellations are made up of much smaller kind of tabletop or even smaller satellites, and that means that there are more players in space. So this leads me on to a question from one of our space engineering students. who wanted to know what's the current biggest threat to the space industry in terms of security. So what kind of threats are you looking at for the space sector?
Now, that's a really loaded question, because I'm going to be really annoying. You have to define threat, and you have to define security, and you have to define sector. So the first thing I want to say is space is not a Wild West. I think that allegory is used a lot of times. That comparison is used understandably a lot of times, but it's not. It's not the Wild West, because a Wild West would be anyone rocking up. And right now it's not. Like, it's not a global commons, which is what space was meant to be. So in my view, the first and most vital threat, which is already, we're already facing, was that space is meant to be, in an ideal world, this thing called a global commons. And a global commons is a utility or a thing like a park or the internet that is meant to be used by everyone, and you can equally gain from it. And you don't sort of burn out the resource selfishly. And that is not happening, as we can tell, right? Like, I've been following space debris incidents a lot. In the past year, there were a few high-profile ones, but the one that sticks with me is the Leo Labs tracking one, which happened, I think, October, November last year, between a defunct Soviet-era piece of space junk that was huge and a Chinese rocket stage. And essentially, there were so many people watching this in real time. I don't know if you remember, Kieran, but it was saying that, if these collide over Earth, that is a lot of power, and you're going to generate loads and loads of debris.
Loads of material coming off.
Loads of material coming off. And that material at the speeds in space, firstly, can hit important satellites, like a country's tracking satellites or their weather satellites or their military satellites, and it can damage them. It's by mistake, because the collision happened, they couldn't control it. It also clouds space, it clouds what astronomers can see, and so it therefore gets in the way of our understanding of space and what it's doing, which ultimately impacts us on Earth. And also it just means that we can't, the more and more this happens, and the more and more you litter orbits like low Earth orbit, or geosynchronous orbit, which is, one of the most important orbits for us, the more and more this happens, the more unusable it becomes, because there is only a finite amount of usable space for us, right? Space is infinite, and I get that, and I understand it, but usable space based on our technological means that is going to be useful for us and necessary for us, for some countries to know whether their agriculture is going to be impacted because there's a massive storm coming, or for a country to know that there is a terrorist incident going on, or to be able to track, where planes are going. These things are impacted by space. Our day-to-day is impacted by space. And the less we can put up there that is updated, the more of
we're limiting ourselves.
Yeah, and that links in with sustainability, right? Because we want to make outer space sustainable for us. I don't think there's anything wrong with using the means appropriately to help life on Earth be more sustainable. But it's kind of like the climate disaster and environment littering on Earth. That is a tragedy of the commons, which is what happens when you have this what did I call space again? The common good or something. Common utility. Yeah. So when you have space, when you have something that is used selfishly or in a way that will reduce its use for other people or will reduce the usefulness of that utility, it's called a tragedy of the commons, right? So that's what's happening in space. It's heading towards that. And sorry, yes.
I was just going to say, when we talk about space debris, a lot of the time people come at it as an engineering challenge of how do you gather it up? But I guess what you're saying here as well is it's a policy problem to not cause that debris in the first place.
Yeah, yes, we need to gather the debris, and that needs to happen. And there are companies like Astroscale that are looking into that and, are doing really, really important work. But until and unless we have regulation on, and when I say regulation, I don't mean an understanding. I mean actual rules about what, I think a really interesting one is one of the rocket stages from a Chinese rocket that was sent up last year that ended up in the Côte d'Ivoire because there was no steering mechanism for the rocket stage and it was single stage. So it started spinning around Earth at a really erratic orbit, which is really dangerous because it can break into loads of big pieces. And obviously, like, it's not the cleanest material. And it missed, I think, New York City, like one of the big chunks, and landed in the Côte d'Ivoire. And that's an issue. Like, you can't continue that. And then the other part of it is, yes, we can regulate things on Earth, but there are things in space already there that are like the defunct Soviet satellite, that we need to think about, which is the other side. So there's a risk reduction element, which is what can we do on Earth? And then there's the sort of aftermath element, which is what can we do retroactively to stop space becoming unusable, essentially.
Yeah. So it sounds like that's a really good example of you using your physics knowledge to really assess a threat.
Yeah.
But then you're having to tie it back to then how do you make that into something that then maybe government bodies or companies will understand to realize that that's something they actually have to deal with.
Yeah, and it goes beyond that. I think you know there are insurers. Stuff that's sent into space is often insured. Yeah. Like, insurance companies need an understanding of this. Lawyers, there is a whole body of space law which focuses around, you know, the legislation surrounding surrounding space. So there are a couple of treaties that exist, the Outer Space Treaty being the most famous one, that exist, and they were written a long time ago. And at the time, people accepted it and said, you know, this serves the purpose because it focused on sort of more military aspects and weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, being put in space and by major countries. But that no longer serves the purpose, because as much as your companies in countries are technically approved by countries, there is always a loophole. And there are more commercial actors, which means not country governments, that are operating in space by sheer number of instruments than there are governments. And so you need to have that in the back of your mind, and you need to think, okay, some of these companies are multinational, so it goes beyond borders. It goes beyond this like idea of national security and travels into international security. And there are efforts, you know, happening. The UN has a body on the sustainable use of space. There are things called the UNLTS, which are, I've forgotten the full form of, but they're to do with long-term that's what LTS stands for, long-term sustainability. So that there are efforts happening, but they're moving slowly and things are happening very quickly. So that's the problem. I mean, I think a fun fact is that 50% of satellites in space are SpaceX. So they are one company.
Yeah, they doubled the number with, I think it was with one launch. It's interesting you said about the what we could do to build this kind of international consensus, because there's been a few questions in the comments about you know, how do we collaborate internationally and break down barriers, and are some of those international barriers and how maybe traditional security and defense have been seen, are some of those challenges that we have to reckon with on Earth?
Yeah.
What do we think about space?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so this is a difficult area to talk about, not least because working in space policy, I still find it hard to understand. Like, I think with things like nuclear, you can draw a map of the relationships in the countries, and that doesn't really exist with space. Like, it's political, heavily political, it's economic, and it's knowledge protection, and it's also a race, like space race, and I hate that term. And then there's also the lack of an understanding that space is already militarized. There's a lack of consensus around the world about what it means to have responsible behavior in space. And so there are efforts. So one of the reasons why you should definitely engage with UK space policy and chat to me about it is because the UK last year took a resolution. So that means, you know, prepared a text which will become some form of regulation, hopefully, but prepared a text to put on the table at the United Nations at this thing called the First Committee. So the First Committee is all to do with disarmament, which is like keeping the world safe from weapons and so on. And they took this resolution and they said, we want to treat space as a system, so the space system, and we want to regulate the behavior. So we want to talk to countries and work out what we should do to draw boundaries on behavior in space to then lead to preventing, war or whatever further on. So that happened in November, and it was approved by a lot of countries, by I think a majority of countries. Now, there are two countries in particular that tend to come up against these kind of things because they want a more treaty-based approach, which is like law, and that's China and Russia. And China and Russia tend to act together on space-related things. But the UK has taken this to the UN. It's been approved. It's been voted on, and now they will start acting on it, hopefully. So it's a great time to start thinking about the questions that you've asked. So in my view, I think there are a few things that we need to understand. I will miss these out, but there are three top things for me. One is understanding what we can see and what we can't see. Where are we? What are our capabilities right now? We do know it, but there's no sort of comprehensive understanding of that. Two is going into countries that think they're not affected by this and need to leave it to the big dogs, which is a terrible term, but the P5 of the Security Council, the permanent 5 members. So that's the UK, the US, Russia, China, and France, and leave it to them and they'll fight it out. That's not true. Everyone is impacted by space, and it impacts society. And a literal demonstration of that is what happened in the Côte d'Ivoire, right? A massive piece of space junk landed. It just landed. These things happen, but also your country's assets. So your military, your agricultural safety, and so on and so forth are impacted by space. These things matter. And you might want to send satellites into space. You might want to start a program on this. So these things matter to you. And I think it's really important to go into those countries and do capacity building without being patronizing. So it's saying, this is why it matters. Let's talk about how to make you able to make it work for you. And then thirdly, there just needs to be a consensus internationally of what is acceptable and what is not. And that is a huge statement to make. And I understand that because I know that we don't have enough time to break it down. But I think things to do with launch guidelines, safety, debris, there needs to be something central which takes together commercial, academia, legal. And that's a very hard thing to do. And it's something I'm interested in doing and I'm working towards figuring out how to do. And I could talk about that for another day, but essentially there needs to be collaborative work, and people need to move away from this idea that it's in the hands of a few countries and it needs to be a treaty. No, it needs to be something that is implementable for everyone. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, the access to space, it's global, our interaction with space, you can't get away from it, and the problems are global. The solutions need to be global.
Exactly, which is, I think, easier said than done. And I do understand that lots of people hear this it needs to be collaborative and interdisciplinary, but it actually needs to be.
It won't do the full job otherwise.
All it takes is one country to break a rule, hit a satellite, shoot it down with an anti-satellite weapon, because it's legal for them to do that, and there are no accountability guidelines, for that to trigger a lot of issues on Earth. That would be considered warfare. If someone took down a communication satellite from a different country, that is critical war. That is a critical attack on a country.
Attacking on a country's infrastructure.
Exactly. And I'm just saying this to make the point, it won't happen. But the last American nuclear posture review that Donald Trump published said that, a nuclear first strike could be legit if someone attacked critical national infrastructure. So do not take this lightly. It won't happen. I don't think it will. Fingers crossed. But countries have already, 4 countries have already shown that they can shoot down satellites that are above the International Space Station. They've shot down their own satellites, and that is a long way away. And it's not safe.
Well, I'm really glad, not about the scary stuff we just talked about, but I'm really glad to know that there are people like you who want to get into this and tackle it. And we're come to the end of our time, Anu, and I've just really enjoyed the conversation. We could have gone on much further. But knowing that you've got such passion and that there are people like you that really want to get into these subjects. So if there ends up being an organization attached to that point 3 and you're in charge of it one day, do remember us and come back and talk to us. Last thing before we go, if you could, in a couple of sentences, if you were to give some advice to a young person interested in space, maybe not maybe sure what they want to do, what would your advice be?
I would say that there is something for everything in space. If you know that you love space, but you're good at art, there need to be people designing the astronaut uniforms. There need to be people designing the artwork that go on rockets. There need to be people that are composing music for these things, for the movies that are going to be written about space. If you like law, there's a room for everyone in this sector. Don't let anyone ever tell you there isn't. And if they do, come find me and I will fight them for you.
Brilliant. Anu, if anyone wants to get in touch with you, would they do so through
Twitter? Is probably the easiest. So it's at ANULIKES TARS. So it's Anu like stars.
Excellent. Brilliant. Thanks very much.
No worries. Thank you so much, Kieran.
No, it's great to chat. I knew this would be a great conversation. To everyone watching, remember you can see more of these Q&As all this week here on the National Space Centre's YouTube channel. You can get in touch with the National Space Academy on Twitter. It's at UK Space Academy. Or you can go to our website, nationalspaceacademy.org, and there's a form there and you can contact us if you'd like to. Send us your career questions for the space sector and we may be able to put them to our other guests later in the week. And this is the first time we've done this takeover week, so we welcome any feedback. Brilliant conversation, and we would have put the world to rights if we'd had another half hour. Thanks again, Anu, and thanks everyone for watching. And we are done.